welcome especially to those who are joining us for the first time. This is our third session as we revisit some significant moments of the events of the Focolare. For those of you who have seen the spot that went through just now, some of those faces you will recognize as our history goes ahead. So pay attention also to these images and you will be able to recognize some people. So we started with the 40s when the movement began during the wartime, and with its absolute novelty and its style that it came, the gospel style that came with it. In that first session, we got to know stories of new vocations that started to emerge in the church, the mystical period that Chiara and her companions went through, and the key to unity. In the 50s, that was in our second session, we saw the emerging of temporary societies built on the gospel, the Mariapolises, the birth of the volunteers, new families, Focolarini priests, and how the movement started to cross the European border. In every session, we take a dive into one decade of our history, based on some video clips done during the 60th anniversary of the movement. There's so much to discover about Chiara and other protagonists of our story, all instruments chosen by God to spread his plan of unity in the church and in the world, and precisely in times and circumstances that seem to be going in the opposite direction. Just like in our times today, when the call to unity is extremely relevant, and God has called us, invited us to be protagonists of today. There's so much to learn from Chiara and those who preceded us in order to continue the realization of this great charism in our own environments, families, workplaces, parishes, in humanity around us. And it was our desire during this centenary anniversary of Chiara to deepen this history of ours right through the decades. So now, today we will walk through the turbulent 60s. Many of you may have lived through this period. What do we have in store, Brian?
Well, this third session, the contents are very interesting, as you said. The approval of the movement by the church. The church had to study it. Then the spread to America, Asia, Africa, and the permanent Mariapolises, the ones who have been to Chiara and other Mariapolises, or as we call it, the mini cities or little towns. Then the birth of the other branches, peace, religious. Then the birth of the ecumenical dialogue.
The 60s were marked by a rising consumerism and general unrest. The young people went out into the streets to express the discontent of their generation and their search for authenticity. The Vietnam War was raging, and for the first time, man landed on the moon.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
The sense of the sacred seemed dead, and people talked of the death of God. But the Holy Spirit was blowing, giving rise to the most significant religious event of the 20th century, Vatican II.
Mine is only one voice, but it sums up the voice of the entire world.
The Catholic Church looks into itself and returns to the idea of communion. Communion within the Church. Communion with the world. Paul VI is the first pope to venture outside the Vatican. A new era of dialogue begins for Christianity.
All right, after this brief introduction through the videos which showed the events of this decade, let's look a little closer to what was actually happening in the world, in the church, and also in the Focolare movement. We start with the 1960s. That year started off as the dawn of a golden age to most Americans, with the election of John F. Kennedy, a very charismatic figure and the nation's first Roman Catholic president. However, in the same year, we see more than 70,000 young people protesting and participating in non-violent sit-ins against racial discrimination. In the 1959, the Mariapoli in the Dolomite Mountains had come to an end, and in 1960, we see the first European Mariapolises being held in Fribourg, Switzerland, where Chiara spoke about the unity of people. In the same year, the movement begins to spread in Eastern European countries, which were still under communist rule. August 1961, the Berlin Wall is being constructed, dividing German territory into East and West. It was built to stop masses of people crossing over to West Germany. In India, we see the Indian army marching into Goa, ejecting the Portuguese. For the first time in 400 years, India is finally freed from foreign colonial domination. And on the world scene, we see the Cuban Missile Crisis erupting in a struggle between USA and Russia. The crisis ends when Kennedy and Khrushchev agree to peacefully dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. 1961 is the beginning of the ecumenical journey of the Focolare movement, with first contacts made in Germany with Lutheran pastors and through Canon Pauli with the Anglican Communion of England. There is a common desire for the spirituality of unity. The movement's ecumenical office in Rome is opened with Centro Uno, having Igino Giordani as its director. In October 1962, the Chinese had crushed the Indian army in the northeast frontier area. For a time, it seemed all of eastern India would be lost. The Chinese attack on India was so overwhelming that the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nearly led to a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union, hardly made an impression in India. In America, at the height of the civil rights movement in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King delivers his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," calling for civil and economic rights and an end to racism in the United States. A few months later, the American president, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The year 1962 is also known for the opening of the Second Vatican Council. The council called between 2,000 and 2,500 bishops and thousands of observers, auditors, sisters, laymen, and laywomen to 4 sessions in St. Peter's Basilica between 1962 and 1965. Cultural changes in the aftermath of World War II spelled a need to reconsider church practices and bring about changes. The Focolare. For the Focolare movement, the year 1962 is also an important date. On the 23rd of March, the movement was finally approved by the Roman Catholic Church as the work of Mary. After a long period of being studied thoroughly, the Focolare was finally recognized as a work of the Catholic Church. The activities of the Focolare movement continue with international ecumenical gatherings promoted by Centro Uno. In 1963, we see the first Mariapolis Center being inaugurated in Rocca di Papa at the outskirts of Rome. May 1964, Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, dies. India in those years was the land of scarcity. A 4-year wait for ambassador, 12 years for a fiat. In the US, Lyndon Johnson, president of the US, approves the Civil Rights Act, which had been promoted by John F. Kennedy. With it, any form of discrimination and segregation based on ethnicity, race, or gender is forbidden by law. In the same year, a massive military action is begun in Vietnam. In 1965, The 17-day war between India and Pakistan caused thousands of casualties on both sides. The hostilities between the two countries ended after a ceasefire was declared following diplomatic intervention by the Soviet Union and the US. In Incisa Valdarno, close to Florence, Italy, the first small town of witness of the Focolare movement begins in the locality of Loppiano, a permanent Mariapolis. During 1964, Chiara visits the United States for the first time and returns once again the year after. In 1965, Chiara visits Africa for the first time, and during the same year, she is invited to speak at the Anglican Cathedral of Liverpool. 1965 is also the year when the Second Vatican Council comes to an end. The Catholic Church had now opened its windows onto the modern world, updated the liturgy, gave a large role to lay people, introduced the concept of religious freedom, and started a dialogue with other religions. We are now in 1966. In China, the Cultural Revolution has been launched. It was a campaign ordered by Mao Zedong to purge the Communist Party of its opponents and instill revolutionary values in the younger generation. On the European continent, we see the regime of the colonials come into power, a far-right military junta that ruled Greece for 7 years. The dictatorship was characterized by right-wing cultural policies, restrictions on civil liberties, and the imprisonment, torture, and exile of political opponents. In 1967, the Naxal movement is born in India after a left-wing peasant uprising in Naxalbar, West Bengal. While the world is stuck with its struggle between powers, the Focolare movement continues expanding. In 1966 in Fontem, Cameroon, Chiara laid the foundation stone for a hospital to fight the high infant mortality among the Bangwa tribe. In the same year, Chiara visits the US a third time. In London, she was received in audience by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Michael Ramsey, Primate of the Church of England, who encouraged the spreading of the spirituality of the Focolare in his own church. In 1967, Chiara visits Istanbul and meets the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras I. In the next 5 years, she would make 8 trips to Istanbul and have 23 audiences with the Patriarch. She became a messenger between Pope Paul VI and Athenagoras, and in the ecumenical field, she continues her activities on various other fronts, meeting Frere Roger Schütz in Rome and the Ecumenical Council of Churches in Geneva, and so on. 1967 marks also the beginning of the Gen movement, the youth branch of the Focolare movement, the New Families movement, and the Parish movement. The protests of 1968 saw a worldwide escalation of social conflicts. Spontaneous groups begin to rise up, not only in the West, creating a vast protest movement that asks for the transformation of society. A reform movement known as the Prague Spring in the Czech Republic is crushed down with force by the Soviet troops. Russia stated that Iron Curtain countries would not be allowed to abandon communism. The situation of the Cold War worsened. In the US, we see Dr. Martin Luther King and later on also Senator Robert F. Kennedy being shot dead. The assassination of King sends shockwaves across the nation, triggering riots in major cities. We remember also in 1969 the first landing on the moon by US astronauts. The Focolare instead continues growing, and in 1968 the New Humanity movement is begun. In Germany, an ecumenical permanent Mariapolis is inaugurated at Ottmaring, and Chiara continues traveling, visiting the US for the 4th time. The 1960s, as we have seen, were one of the most tumultuous and divisive decades in world history, marked by the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and anti-war protests, political assassinations, and the emerging generation gap. This is the background to the stories which we will now be listening to.
So one of the important milestones in the 60s, as we heard, was the approval of the movement by the Holy See. Surely these years of inquiry by the church authorities, which started already in the 50s, was one of the most trying and painful periods for Chiara. But she has spoken very little about it. For Chiara, it has been genuinely difficult to remember and recount details of what it was for her being under scrutiny from the very church she loved and sought to serve. Her opinion has always been that the church is mother, and so you don't criticize your own mother. Most of what is probably known is through her companions, some documents. So here's an attempt to give you just a glimpse of this period. In the 1950s already, Chiara and the Focolare were getting popular. There was an increase in numbers from ordinary people to members of parliament to heads of religious orders. So the church, through the Holy Office, now called the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, started to investigate. It is said that in more than one occasions, the investigators who came to interview Chiara were so moved by the simplicity and the beauty of her message that they left in tears. However, there was a certain climate of fear among the Focolarini. Chiara herself kept a low profile during those years of silence, as they called it. She did not cease or slow down her activities, but avoided putting herself in the forefront. In fact, at the last Mariapolis in 1959, when they were all together, Chiara wrote the talks for the Mariapolis, but they were all delivered by her first companions. In that year, even priests and religious were asked not to frequent the Focolare. But the Holy Spirit was also at work. Just to share one of the interesting stories, and here we'll show you some photos as well. In 1950, in the 50s, let's say, Giulia Folonari, she's the one that you can see on the right-hand side playing the piano. She was a young girl from Brescia. You can see her with her brother in the center, Eletto Folonari. We will hear about him later, playing the cello. So they are from North Italy, from a well-off family of wine producers. And Giulia desired to join the Focolare. Later, Chiara gave her the name Eli. Some of you may remember Eli. She accompanied Chiara to India. So Eli's parents were not in favor of her involvement in the Focolare. Instead, Eli was determined. So with the excuse of some business work in Rome for her father, she left home and moved to Rome and ended up staying in the Focolare. In those days, Chiara had shared a thought with everyone in which she also mentioned that not even a day should pass without sharing the ideal, the spirituality with someone new. Now, Eli was new to Rome, so she racked her brains to think of someone. She remembered a distant relative she knew who was a priest in Rome, Monsignor Montini. So she made contact with him. He also had certain responsibilities in the Vatican. He was happy to greet Ellie and meet her, and quite pleased to understand that what she was involved in. Later, Ellie introduced Chiara to him. In their meeting, he assured Chiara that the investigation by the Holy Office was actually protection and a guarantee for the movement. Protection because you are in the heart of the church, he said, and guarantee because you are sure that what you do is Christian. Monsignor Montini was also a confidant of Pope Pius XII. So through him, a private audience was arranged for Chiara and some of her close collaborators. The Pope was happy with their work and blessed them. However, the investigations and criticisms continued. Chiara was criticized for misleading the young people as they were joining the Focolare, that she was promoting communist ideas because she spoke of unity, or that she was encouraging people to read the scripture without guidance from the church, even though she always submitted the word of life commentaries before publishing them. So the period of suspension, uncertainty, and forsakenness continued. And yet, as we saw, it was also a time of immense blessings and new openings. In 1958, when it seemed that an official approval was imminent, Pope Pius XII died. He was succeeded by Pope John the 23rd, who took up the matter and appointed a commission to oversee this investigation. After a 2-year-long study, in 1962, just a few months prior to the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, Pope John the 23rd officially and publicly approved the statutes of the work of Mary, the Focolare movement. A year later, in June 1963, Pope John the 23rd died, and the conclave elected Pope Paul VI, who brought to completion the Second Vatican Council. This new pope was none other than Monsignor Montini, the relative of Eli Folonari. On 31st October 1964, on the eve of All Saints' Day, Pope Paul VI received Chiara and Eli in a private audience, and Chiara brought him up to date on all the developments in the movement. He called it a work of God and was interested in knowing everything, particularly about the ecumenical dialogue, wishing that the movement would specialize in it and open itself also to non-believers. The relationship between Pope Paul VI and Chiara grew ever close over the years and with deep mutual esteem. So these were just some flashes of that particular period in the movement. Now we jump to another development. Over to you, Nisha.
Yeah, so we'd have to go back a little bit, because in the last meeting, we saw about, we looked at the Mariapolis, which had begun as this big summer gathering. And at the end of summer, what would happen? Those same towns that were so filled with people who were fully alive and so close to one another were deserted, because everyone went back home. And Chiara really dreamt of a town where the ideal of unity could be lived 24/7, which would be a model for humanity, and where also living this ideal, the fruits of unity could be experienced. And that dream took shape when Eletto, that's Vincenzo Folonari, Eli's brother, entered the Focolare. Since he came from a well-to-do family, he donated his inheritance of 200 acres of land in Lopiano to the movement. Many members of the movement, families, professionals, youth, offer their time, their energy, and their resources to constructing a little city in Lopiano. At that time, it was an abandoned piece of land which was not very accessible. Interestingly, that very same year, a big highway was being built, and the government decided that one of the exits would be Lopiano. Let's watch a clip.
Quando partì il grosso dei cittadini mariapoliti.
As the participants of the Mariapolis were leaving, everything seemed to come to an end. The streets were empty. The valley was bright and sunny, but it seemed so lifeless now. My thoughts returned to those enchanted months, sweetly perfumed by the presence of Mary. But perhaps I wasn't just thinking back, but I was looking upwards and unconsciously asking Mary to find a way to make the Mariapolis, her city, last forever.
Ogni ombra rischiara noi Gesù. Andiamo, andiamo, fratelli all'unità, acceso il fuoco dell'amor, un solo canto a noi, solo una fede in cuore, e la gioia di riunirci in te, Gesù.
That was fascinating, but we must go on. So there was the mini city, and soon came an invitation to open a Focolare in the United States of America. Today, Mariapolis Luminosa, as it's called, is located in the beautiful Hudson Valley and has gatherings of people of all ages, all races, all faiths. In the 1980s, Luminosa Award for Unity was institutionalized, given in recognition of work towards building universal brotherhood. The late Dr. Shantilal Somaya, chairman of the KJ Somaya Trust, Mumbai, and one of Chiara's close collaborators in Hindu-Christian dialogue, was one of the recipients in 2002. But our story now begins in 1961, when Chiara sent two young women, the first Focolare there, to the bustling megacity of New York.
I'm Saranella. Let me tell you something about the Focolare in North America. Like other countries, it has a unique story. It all began with a lady from Detroit who heard about this life of the gospel from two Italian priests. She went to a Mariapolis in Switzerland and asked Chiara to send Focolarinas to the U.S. Silvana and Joe Vernuccio made the first trip to the U.S. They came back and told Chiara that it would be good to open a Focolare house in New York. And so in September 1961, just 1 year after I had entered the Focolare, I was on my way to the United States with Antonio Petrilli and Joe.
Ricordo il momento del saluto di Chiara.
I remember when we said goodbye to Chiara. She looked very lovingly at Joe and me, and she said, "Gosh, two young women in that big metropolis. But Jesus in the midst will protect you." We never forgot her words. One night, just a few days after we arrived, we were in the subway near Broadway.
Tanta gente entrava e usciva.
People were coming and going, looking very serious. We felt a pang in our heart. We felt as if we were in an iceberg that was slowly crushing us. And then we thought, it's true. It's just two of us in that big city. But with God's help, we were ready to give our lives for each other. So Jesus was most probably there in our midst. And all of a sudden, that big city with its skyscrapers and impressive suspended bridges seemed nothing compared to Jesus, who loved us so much that he even found a way to stay with us and to walk with us through the streets. I remember the happiness that filled our hearts. In those days, we didn't have any videos or magazines to show. All we had was our life to show God's love to the others. We had a treasure that was much greater than all those magnificent things around us. And in our hearts we were convinced that God will triumph. Graziella, Enzo, Josie, Cari, Nunzio Maria, Sapi, Magda are only a few of the many people who helped to weave the story of North America. Chiara's visits marked magnificent milestones in this story. On her first visit in 1964, her first impression of the Americans was that they were a simple people. She spoke of New York as the Golden City. In 1965, she saw the practical mindedness of the American people and thought of a Mariapolis Center and a Focolare magazine.
68, cuore per cuore.
1968, Heart for a Heart. Chiara asked Jesus to give us his heart in exchange for ours. 1990, the permanent Mariapolis was born, a blueprint of a multi-ethnic country that dreams of a city on the hilltop. 1997, Chiara received an honorary degree in humanities promoted by a rabbi. She spoke to African American Muslims in Harlem. She also gave a speech at the United Nations. 2000, numerous initiatives to promote unity in the society. And the story continues. As Chiara once said, there are those who sow, there are those who gather. In paradise, everything will belong to everyone. Thank you.
And as the world went ahead in new and different ways, so did the movement, westwards to the Americas and eastwards to Asia and Australia. The people of the Philippines welcomed the ideal with open arms and open hearts. The movement grew rapidly there and continues to grow and give birth to many vocations too. Beyond Australia, the movement has a presence in the surrounding Pacific Islands as well. This region is called Oceania.
In the second half of the 60s, the spirituality of unity truly reached the ends of the earth. In February 1966, the first group of Focolarini arrived in Manila, in the Philippines. Just a few months later, hundreds of people went to the weekend Mariapolises held in Tagaytay and Cebu. By the end of the 60s, the Focolare had reached many other countries in Asia. And in 1967, Rita Muccio, an Italian Focolarina, went to Melbourne for work. That was the beginning of the Focolare in Australia and New Zealand. Then to the islands of Futuna and Fiji.